Long ago, in a time when the world was young and humanity was learning to walk the delicate path of faith, the first family struggled with silent battles of the heart. The story of Cain and Abel serves as a poignant reminder of how unnoticed sins can fester and grow, eventually leading to devastation. Cain, a farmer, and Abel, a shepherd, both brought offerings to God. But while Abel's offering reflected a heart full of devotion, Cain's revealed resentment and a lack of true surrender. When God accepted Abel's offering but rejected Cain's, an unseen seed of envy and bitterness took root within Cain's heart, growing silently until it led to the ultimate tragedy, fratricide. This story is more than an account of the first murder, it's a reflection of how silent sins, left unchecked, can alienate us from God and lead to spiritual ruin. The subtlety of these sins is what makes them so dangerous. They often begin as seemingly small compromises, tiny thoughts or actions we justify to ourselves. Over time, however, they take root, separating us from our Creator. In today's world, the enemy's tactics haven't changed, they've simply adapted to the modern landscape. Silent sins now disguise themselves as harmless distractions, habitual complacency, or internalized judgments. Without even realizing it, we may find ourselves distant from God, much like Cain, who allowed his unchecked emotions to dominate his life. The objective of this journey is to uncover these silent pitfalls that Satan uses to steer us away from God. Each sin we discuss is a carefully laid trap, designed to go unnoticed but capable of causing immense spiritual harm. By understanding these pitfalls, we can equip ourselves to resist them, strengthen our faith, and deepen our relationship with God. The stage is set. Imagine a society where faith was not just a personal endeavor but a community's heartbeat. In the biblical world, prayer, rituals, and shared beliefs were integral to daily life. The Israelites, for example, centered their lives around the temple, gathering for festivals and sacrifices that served as both acts of worship and moments of connection with God. Yet, even in such a devout society, silent sins crept in. The distractions of wealth, social standing, and personal grievances often pulled individuals away from their spiritual duties. Their struggles mirror our own, showing that the battle against sin is universal and timeless. Today, we begin by exploring the first of these 5 silent sins, spiritual complacency. This sin is subtle yet pervasive, sneaking into the routines of our lives and slowly eroding the foundation of our faith. The silent sin number 1, spiritual complacency. Spiritual complacency is like a slow, creeping fog that envelopes the soul. It doesn't arrive with fanfare, rather, it seeps into the cracks of our daily routines. At first, it feels harmless. Perhaps you skip a prayer one night because you're too tired or miss a day of Bible reading because your schedule is overwhelming. Before you know it, these small lapses become habits, and the vibrant connection you once had with God fades into a distant memory. Think of spiritual complacency as a neglected plant. In the beginning, it thrives under careful attention, daily watering, pruning, and sunlight. But once neglected, even slightly, the plant begins to wilt. Similarly, our spiritual lives require daily nourishment through prayer, scripture, and communion with God. A modern-day example. Consider Sarah, a young professional who once dedicated the first hour of her day to prayer and reflection. She found solace and strength in her morning routine, which anchored her amidst the chaos of work and life. But as her responsibilities grew, Sarah began to prioritize other tasks. Just for today, she told herself as she skipped her prayer time. Days turned into weeks, and eventually, her once steadfast routine became a distant memory. Over time, Sarah felt a void she couldn't quite place, a growing sense of disconnection from her faith and purpose. Sarah's story reflects a truth many of us experience. Complacency doesn't announce itself, it sneaks in quietly, disguised as busyness or exhaustion. Yet its impact can be profound, leaving us vulnerable to doubt, fear, and spiritual stagnation. As you reflect on your own life, ask yourself, have I allowed spiritual complacency to take root? Is my connection with God as strong as it once was? If you feel distant or unsure, know that it's never too late to return. Start small, perhaps with 5 minutes of prayer each morning or a single Bible verse to meditate on during your day. These small steps can rekindle your faith and strengthen your spiritual foundation. If this message is resonating with you, take a moment to support this channel. By liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing, you're not only helping spread this important message but also staying connected to future content that can inspire and guide your spiritual journey. Together, let's build a community of faith and encouragement. Hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts below. We'd love to hear how you're taking steps to guard your heart against these silent threats. Centuries ago, King Solomon, one of the wisest men to ever live, reflected deeply on the nature of life and its meaning. In the book of Ecclesiastes, he wrote, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." The Hebrew word for vanity, hevel, translates to something fleeting or meaningless, like vapor or smoke. Solomon observed how people chase after things that appear substantial but ultimately vanish, leaving behind emptiness. His lamentation is as relevant today as it was thousands of years ago. Modern distractions are our version of Solomon's hevel. While we may not be chasing physical idols or vast empires, we are often captivated by the glowing screens in our hands, scrolling endlessly through social media feeds or binge-watching shows to escape the stresses of daily life. These distractions promise momentary relief but often leave us feeling hollow and disconnected, from others, from ourselves, and from God. A new form of idolatry. In the ancient world, idolatry was the act of worshipping false gods, often through rituals and sacrifices. Today, the form has changed, but the essence remains. We sacrifice our time, energy, and even relationships on the altar of digital distractions. Consider how many hours we spend mindlessly scrolling or engaging in trivial online debates, neglecting opportunities to deepen our faith or serve others. Imagine the Israelites waiting at the foot of Mount Sinai. While Moses was receiving divine instruction, they grew restless and turned to a golden calf for comfort and distraction. How often do we create our own golden calves, in the form of endless distractions, seeking solace in temporary comforts rather than in the eternal presence of God? The cost of futility. Futility drains us of the energy we could devote to meaningful pursuits. For example, consider Maria, a mother juggling work and family responsibilities. In her few moments of quiet, she found herself glued to her phone, losing track of time as she scrolled through reels and posts. Over weeks and months, she noticed a growing sense of dissatisfaction. The joy she once found in her faith and family began to fade, replaced by the fleeting thrill of online validation. Maria's story is a reflection of a deeper issue. When we devote our attention to distractions, we leave less room for spiritual nourishment. Just as a cluttered room can make it difficult to find what you need, a cluttered mind can obscure God's voice. Breaking the cycle. But there's hope. Breaking free from the cycle of futility begins with awareness and intentionality. Take a moment to reflect on your own habits. How often do you find yourself lost in distractions that leave you feeling empty? What could you achieve if that time were redirected toward prayer, scripture, or acts of service? Consider a simple but profound practice, a digital Sabbath. Set aside specific times to disconnect from your devices and reconnect with God and those around you. Replace mindless scrolling with meaningful reflection, replacing the hevel of distractions with the substance of faith. A biblical perspective. Jesus spoke directly to the issue of misplaced priorities in Matthew 6 verse 21, "For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." When we invest our time and energy in fleeting distractions, we risk placing our hearts in things that cannot sustain us. But when we shift our focus to eternal treasures, our relationship with God and our service to others, we find fulfillment that no distraction can offer. Futility and distractions may feel like minor issues, but they are silent thieves of spiritual growth. When we allow ourselves to become absorbed in the temporary, we lose sight of the eternal. Yet, by identifying and addressing these habits, we can redirect our hearts and minds toward God, breaking free from the endless cycle of Hevel. As we move forward, consider this: are there distractions in your life pulling you away from what truly matters? Stay with us as we explore the next silent sin and uncover how these unseen forces work to distance us from God. Each step we take in awareness is a step closer to reclaiming our spiritual focus and purpose. In the Gospels, we find a vivid account of judgment disguised as righteousness. Jesus confronted the Pharisees, religious leaders who prided themselves on their strict adherence to the law. Yet, their hearts were far from God. They judged others harshly, believing they were morally superior. In Matthew 7 verses 3-5, Jesus asked, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye?" This pointed question unveils a universal truth: judgment is often rooted in pride and blindness to our own flaws. Judgment in the modern age. In our modern world, judgment takes on new forms. It may not manifest as public condemnation but in silent, internal critiques. How often do we scroll through social media, mentally critiquing the choices, appearances, or lifestyles of others? This quiet form of judgment is no less dangerous because it slowly hardens our hearts and distances us from God's love and compassion. Imagine Sarah, a young professional who prided herself on her strong faith and commitment to godly living. Over time, she developed a habit of silently critiquing her coworkers' choices. She didn't vocalize her judgments, but they shaped her interactions, making her less approachable and compassionate. Though she appeared outwardly kind, her internal criticisms created a chasm between her and God's calling to love others unconditionally. A new perspective on judgment. Judgment often begins with comparison, a subtle but corrosive force. In comparing ourselves to others, we either inflate our own ego or diminish our sense of worth. Neither outcome aligns with God's purpose for us. The Apostle Paul reminds us in Romans 14 verse 10, "You, then, why do you judge your brother or sister? Or why do you treat them with contempt? For we will all stand before God's judgment seat." The act of judging others blinds us to the grace God has extended to each of us. When we focus on the faults of others, we fail to acknowledge the ongoing work God is doing in their lives, and in ours. Replacing judgment with empathy. What if, instead of judging, we chose empathy? Empathy invites us to see others through God's eyes, recognizing their struggles and celebrating their progress. When you find yourself critiquing someone, pause and ask, what might this person be going through? This simple question shifts the narrative, fostering compassion and understanding. Consider a biblical example: the woman caught in adultery, brought before Jesus in John 8 verses 1-11. Her accusers sought to condemn her, but Jesus turned their judgment back on them, saying, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone." This act of mercy illustrates the power of refraining from judgment and extending grace instead. The impact of criticism on spiritual growth. Judgment doesn't just harm others, it hinders our spiritual growth. By focusing on others' perceived flaws, we miss opportunities to confront our own. True transformation begins when we look inward, allowing God to refine our hearts. Jesus calls us to self-reflection, urging us to remove the plank from our own eye before addressing the speck in someone else's. Imagine John, a church elder who often found fault in the younger members of his congregation. Over time, his criticisms alienated those he sought to mentor. One day, a trusted friend challenged him to reflect on his own imperfections. This moment of humility led John to approach others with grace and encouragement rather than criticism. His relationships flourished, and his connection with God deepened as he embraced a spirit of empathy. The journey to transformation. Overcoming judgment requires intentionality. Begin by inviting God to search your heart. Pray as the psalmist did, "Search me, God, and know my heart, test me and know my anxious thoughts, Psalm 139 verse 23. Ask for His guidance in replacing judgment with love and criticism with encouragement. Build habits that align with God's heart. For example, when tempted to critique, offer a prayer for the person instead. This practice not only transforms your perspective but also invites God's grace into the situation. Judgment may seem like a harmless internal act, but it subtly distorts our hearts and pulls us away from God's command to love unconditionally. As we explore the next silent sin, consider this: what would happen if you replaced judgment with empathy? How might your relationships and spiritual journey change? These are very important questions that may go unnoticed by you, but now that you have had the opportunity to see them, try to answer each of these questions very carefully and, depending on the answer, seek internal improvement. The subtle danger of indifference lies in its invisibility. Unlike overt sins, indifference doesn't announce itself loudly, it seeps into our hearts quietly, whispering lies that the needs of others don't matter, or that our own struggles are too great to consider anyone else. It convinces us to withdraw into our own world, shutting out the cries for help around us. This is not a new problem. Jesus warned of it in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Luke 10 verses 25 to 37. A man is beaten and left for dead on the road. Two respected religious figures pass by without stopping. Why? Perhaps they were too busy, too preoccupied, or simply indifferent to the man's suffering. Only the Samaritan, a cultural outcast, paused to offer help. This story isn't just about charity, it's about the corrosive power of indifference and the life-changing impact of compassion. Indifference in today's world. In our modern lives, indifference often looks like avoidance. Perhaps you see a friend struggling but tell yourself, "I don't have time to get involved." Maybe you witness an injustice but assume someone else will step in. Each small act of turning away creates a distance, not only between us and others but also between us and God. Consider Lisa, a successful entrepreneur. Her schedule was packed with meetings, deadlines, and social events. She often noticed opportunities to help others, a colleague overwhelmed with work, a homeless person on her route to the office, but she felt too drained to take action. Over time, her indifference left her feeling isolated and spiritually disconnected. When Lisa finally decided to volunteer at a local shelter, she rediscovered the joy of serving others and, in turn, her relationship with God deepened. From indifference to engagement. Breaking free from indifference requires intentional engagement. Start small, offer a kind word to a struggling friend, or dedicate an hour a week to volunteering. Each act of compassion chips away at the walls of indifference, allowing God's love to flow through you. Paul reminds us in Galatians 6 verse 2, "Carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ." Every time you step out of your comfort zone to help someone, you align yourself with God's heart. Mental overload, the silent thief. In contrast to indifference, mental overload screams for attention. It fills every moment with noise, responsibilities, and endless to-do lists. In this state, even our time with God feels rushed or absent. Jesus modeled a different approach. Despite the demands of his ministry, he often withdrew to quiet places to pray, recharging spiritually and emotionally. Mental overload convinces us that we don't have time for God. It pushes us to prioritize everything else, leaving our faith malnourished. But here's the truth: the more we're overwhelmed, the more we need him. He invites us in Matthew 11 verse 28, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." A biblical call to rest. Imagine a world where we truly embraced God's rest. Picture Martha, bustling in the kitchen, preparing for Jesus' visit, while her sister Mary simply sits at his feet, soaking in his presence. Martha's busyness, though well-intentioned, kept her from experiencing the fullness of what Jesus offered. Mary has chosen what is better, he gently reminded her, Luke 10 verse 42. The lesson here is clear: when we allow mental overload to dominate our lives, we miss out on the peace and presence of God. But by creating intentional moments of stillness, we can reconnect with Him even amidst life's chaos. Practical steps for overcoming overload. To combat mental overload, start by simplifying your priorities. Ask yourself, what truly matters? Schedule quiet time with God as non-negotiable. Try meditating on Scripture, journaling your prayers, or simply sitting in silence, inviting His peace to wash over you. Consider Tom, a father of 3, who struggled to find balance between work and family. He began dedicating 10 minutes each evening to prayer and reflection, asking God to guide his steps. Over time, those 10 minutes grew into a habit that brought clarity and calm to his busy life. Tom found that by placing God first, everything else began to fall into place. As we've explored these 5 silent sins, spiritual complacency, futility, judgment, indifference, and mental overload, one thing becomes clear: they are subtle yet powerful forces that can distance us from God. But the good news is this: each of these pitfalls is also an opportunity for growth, transformation, and a deeper relationship with our Creator. The journey doesn't end here. This video is just the beginning of a conversation. What steps will you take today to recognize and address these silent sins in your life? How will you draw closer to God in the process? If this message has impacted you, don't keep it to yourself, share it with others. Let's grow together as a community of faith, supporting one another in this ongoing spiritual journey. Be sure to subscribe to the channel for more insights and encouragement, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and don't forget to like the video. Every interaction helps spread this message to those who need it most. The final question is this: what will you do today to silence the distractions and open your heart fully to God? The choice is yours, and the time is now. Let's move forward together.